Hello, class. As we study Unit 1, A City Upon a Hill, it's important that we understand the worlds that were connected when Columbus opened the door between them in 1492, and to really see how the connection between these three worlds will contribute to our understanding of American exceptionalism. If we consider the world before 1492, before Columbus opened that door, it's very essential for us to understand that world history before America can provide us some very important clues. First, we know that the separation of Native American peoples from European and Asian peoples at the end of the Ice Age was a very key moment in history. Historians and archaeologists debate the date and method of that separation, but we do know that people who originally migrated from Africa through Europe and Asia came across the Bering Strait during and after the Ice Age into the Americas, and then very quickly spread throughout North, Central, and South America, developing incredibly complicated and advanced societies. These early native peoples were advanced in both technology and social organization. And because so much of American history has focused on the European contributions, we often ignore or forget the complicated and advanced societies that existed in Native America before any European contact. If we think about some examples, we can see it very clearly in Central America with the Olmec people, who were the ancestors of the Mayan civilization. These Olmec people made incredibly advanced cities on the tops of mountains using an advanced architecture that was without beasts of burden or the wheel. These Olmec and Mayan people developed massive trade routes and irrigation networks that showed their technological advancement throughout that region. There were cities and people living in Central America that far outpaced the populations of major European cities at the same time. A great example of the technological sophistication of Native American society existed with the Aztec people in what is today Mexico. These Aztec people had a very complex religious and economic system that was based around agriculture and trade, and the god kings of these massive cities were interconnected across Central America with the equivalent of millions of citizens in their city-states. Similarly, in Middle America, in North America, especially in the region today known as the Mississippi River Valley and the Eastern Woodlands, we had massive trade networks in the Hopewell culture. These mound builders were architecturally sophisticated, had massive trade networks that traded goods and products all throughout the Americas, and lived in massive cities, such as the one we see here at Cahokia on modern-day St. Louis. Similarly, the Eastern Woodlands people, the Iroquois, lived in matrilineal societies that allowed for cooperation between tribal groups, and the 5 nations of the Iroquois banded together to form a confederacy that allowed for the model of a democratic system in the Native American cultures. These 4 examples provide us incredible evidence of diverse, advanced societies that existed well before Columbus opened the door between Europe and Native America. And too many history books leave out these important stories that contribute to the creation of the United States of America. The technologies of Native American cultures, like the genetic modification of a plant that became corn, will revolutionize the world as corn will be spread across the world in the Columbian Exchange. We often think about European technology as being superior with guns and cannons and gunpowder, but in fact, the Native American longbow was far more efficient and sophisticated than any gun would be for the Native American people. Their slash and burn agricultural techniques absolutely modified their landscapes to make them more usable and environmentally friendly. The architectural techniques of many of these native groups are incredible when you look at the surviving monuments and structures and temples that exist throughout Central America and the southwestern United States. Their irrigation techniques, their architectural advancement was well ahead of anything happening in Europe in the 1400s. And if we think about the contributions of the Iroquois Confederacy to our ideas about democratic governmental systems, we can see that here in Native America, we had incredible examples of everything from technology and weapons to agriculture and architecture to governmental systems. If we turn our attention to Africa, we see a very similar story. Before any connection with European states, we know that there's complex societies and empires in Africa that had their own accomplishments and achievements. We can look at examples like Mali in the 12th century. In the 1100s, there was a massive city, one of the largest cities in the world at that time, larger than any city in Europe in the 1100s, larger than Paris, larger than London. Timbuktu, this city was a center of salt, gold, ivory, and the slave trade, and it became an incredible center of Islamic culture and education from the 1400s all the way through the 1600s. Timbuktu, which we can see in this illustration here, was a massive city that included universities and a library larger than any that existed in the world at that time. Similarly, from the years 1000 to 1600, 600 years, the Empire of Benin dominated trade routes along the coast of Africa and was a military and trade power for hundreds of years. Along with this trade sophistication came incredibly advanced artistic accomplishments, as we can see in this ivory carved sculpture. So in both Native America and Africa, we have cultural, architectural, governmental, economic advancements and power that existed outside the world of Europe, the world that almost every American history textbook focuses its attention to because of the worlds that Columbus would connect in 1492. Now let's turn our attention to that European world and how that European world would affect the rest of the globe. We can see by looking at this map a very important geographical factor about the development of Europe. And it's one of the reasons why Europe will become so impactful on the rest of the world. Notice, as you look at this map, the small, compact geographic area that is Europe. It is that small, compact geography that is going to drive Europeans to compete so fiercely against each other for land and precious resources. That competition will drive the development of European states, and those European nation states, France, Spain, Portugal, Britain, those European nation states will compete against each other to find and take as many of those resources as they can from the rest of the world. And that will lead to the development of exploration, new technologies, new weapons, and all of those competitive tools will have an impact on the worlds we just discussed, the worlds of Native America and Africa, who will be drawn into this competition between these European states. So when we think about the world that Columbus will connect in 1492, it's important that we consider exactly how that world will impact the others. We know that European feudal culture developed this competitive society that was fueled by the idea of mercantilism. Mercantilism is the idea that there's a limited amount of wealth in the world, and whoever gets the most of that wealth wins. That idea really pushed Europeans to the idea that the ends justify the means. Do whatever you have to do to win in order to come out on top. And this competition for wealth and power inspired capitalism, the creation of states, the development of new technologies, and ultimately European exploration to find as many of those products and material goods that they could take from the rest of the world. So these European states, specifically Spain, Portugal, England, and France, are going to have an enormous impact on Africa and Native America as this competition drives them to find new resources. But the world that Columbus opened the door to in 1492, and the things that passed through that door, which we call the Columbian Exchange, is really going to shape everything that comes after. So we can look at Columbus as a hero, or we can look at Columbus as a villain, or we can look at Columbus essentially as a person who accidentally bumped into North and Central America, never realizing what he had actually done. But regardless of how we see him as an individual, and whether we celebrate him or vilify him, we can see that the door he opened will lead to America. And that door that he opened, the Columbian Exchange, is incredibly impactful. Think about the things that came from Europe, Africa, and Asia to the Americas. Things like sugar and grapes and bananas, livestock like cattle and sheep and pigs and horses, incredibly important. And then what came from the Americas to Europe? Maize, that corn that was invented, genetically modified by Native Americans, will be one of the most important food crops that will feed the entire world. Similarly, potatoes, pumpkins, squash, peppers, tobacco. These items are going to be incredibly impactful in shaping Europe and Africa and Asia moving forward. But by far the most impactful of the Columbian Exchange was the disease that was spread from Europeans who are now coming in contact with Native Americans that have been separated from them for thousands of years. So way back in the Ice Age, we know that Native Americans were separated from their European, Asian, and African brothers and sisters. And that separation over thousands of years led to the buildup of different immunities. And those different immunities that protected the interconnected European, African, Middle Eastern, and Asian societies did not extend to Native American peoples. And millions of Native Americans will die from diseases like smallpox and influenza, the measles, whooping cough, completely transforming the world and in many ways ending the development of those Native American cultures. So now we can see that we have this old world, which was Europe, and this new world, which was Native America. And these two worlds have two very different ways of doing things. And what's going to happen when they connect with each other? Well, we can see those connections because Europe's quest for additional resources led them to look outside. We don't see that happening in Native America. They weren't looking for resources. They weren't looking to dominate others. There wasn't a competition in Native America. That's why they're not exploring and going to other parts of the world, whereas Europeans are desperate to win the game and get more in terms of this idea of mercantilism. So they're going to spread outward, and we're going to see 4 examples of that we need to remember. First, Portugal. The Portuguese will be some of the first to sort of explore outward, and it makes sense because if you think about where Portugal is on the map, you can see it there in the upper left-hand corner where it says Lisbon. You can see Portugal there right on the edge of Spain, sticking out into the Atlantic Ocean. So clearly Portugal is going to develop this seafaring capability probably faster than any other European country except maybe England. So as Portugal develops, they actually have a school for navigators. They have a school where navigators can go and learn the craft of navigation. And for Europeans, getting to India, getting to China was a key motivating factor. They could not cross Asia because of the geography and the basic hordes of Mongols, and the Genghis Khan and his people were basically blocking any European attempts to cross by land through Asia into India and China. And so because of that, they had to try to find some other way to get to India, where they knew there were valuable trade resources, so they could expand their empire by moving into India and China. But in order to do that, they had to figure out how to get there. So we see people from Portugal, people like Vasco da Gama and Bartholomew Dias, who will try to go around Africa. And on this map you can really see that they didn't really have the capability of a full-on ocean-going trip all the way around Africa. So they're going to consistently stop along the coast of Africa. And you can see where in 1434, in 1455, in 1460, they would make stops around the coast of Africa. And interestingly, as a result of this and this need for Europeans to control whatever resources they could, that's where we're going to start to see Europeans enslaving Africans to use as part of this competition. It's a free labor source, so it gives them an advantage. And that's going to start really here when these Portuguese explorers are exploring the coast of Africa. They're going to start trading for African slaves and taking control of African slaves, which will carry over into this connection with American slavery later on. So it's important to see where that starts. So for the Portuguese, it's really this quest to get to Asia, to get to India and China. And all the other countries in Europe now, because of the competition, they're going to want to do the same thing. So now Spain decides, I've got to do it too. I've got to go out there as a Spanish empire, and I've got to get to India, I've got to get to China to get these resources so I can beat Portugal in this competition. So what does the Spanish Empire do? Well, Columbus, who was actually an Italian, goes to the king and queen of Spain and says, I have an idea of how to do this in a way that's better than the Portuguese way. Let's go straight across and go around the world instead. The problem is, Columbus and other Europeans at the time thought the world was about half the size that it actually is. They didn't even think the Western Hemisphere existed. So by sailing away from Spain and sailing in a westerly direction from Spain, instead of going around Africa, going south, if they go west across the Atlantic, they thought they would just circle around the globe and they would come to China. And that was actually Columbus's theory. They would come to China and India, which is where their destination was. So Columbus and then the people who would follow him appealed to the Spanish government by saying, hey, we can expand the Spanish Empire and spread the word of God. Spanish people were very Catholic. Spread the word of God, and in the meantime, get more gold for Spain. So the Spanish approach is very much gathering this gold and spreading the word of God. And once Columbus opens the door and finds this new world that exists, they're going to try to come to that new world and find what resources they can get here. The reason we call Native Americans Indians is because Columbus thought he was in India when he first arrived. So there's some debate about whether Columbus even knew whether or not he had not found India and China, but instead had found a whole new world. So this new world that's opened up by Columbus, people will follow him. And those Spanish explorers who follow Columbus are known as the conquistadors. Now this map I think is really useful because it shows us the Spanish exploration routes and it shows us the Portuguese exploration routes. So you can actually see in this map the red is the areas that were explored by the Spanish. So you've got Columbus, and you can see his voyages there that were down towards the Antilles and Cuba and eventually Central America near Costa Rica. But then you can see all these other red areas on the map that the Spanish explored. And note, that's going to come and put them in direct conflict with those Central American natives that we talked about before, the Aztec and the Inca people. So the Aztec would be right around where Mexico is located, and the Inca people would be down where you can see Peru on the map of South America, on the left-hand side of that map of South America. So obviously these Spanish explorers, their job is going to be to spread the word of God and steal as much gold as they can. Conveniently for them, the only two Native American cultures that had a substantial amount of gold were the Aztec and the Inca. And they're going to basically wipe those people out. One little side note, if you notice that the Portuguese also spread down into, eventually when they figured out that there was a whole new hemisphere here, they actually will also come down and spread into part of South America. And that's why Brazil today, the official language of Brazil is actually Portuguese, where the rest of Central and South America speak Spanish. So that should give you a little insight into why people in Brazil today speak Portuguese instead of Spanish. So the other two countries we have to think about are France and Spain. And the French sort of come later to this idea. Once they know there is a new world, once they know that there is a North and South America, they don't know how big it is. And their quest here is not to sort of use this new place they've found. Their quest is still to get through it, to get by it in order to get to India and China, which was where they knew all these trade goods were. So they're going to be constantly looking for the Northwest Passage. This Northwest Passage is what these European people called the passageway through North and South America. Now, we know by looking at geography that there is no passage. There is no way through North and South America until much, much later when we dig the Panama Canal. But back in those days, there was no way through. So they would be looking for every river to see how far that river would go inland, and hopefully it would dump them out on the other side into the Pacific Ocean. So they're looking for this Northwest Passage. And if you look at these purple lines here, we can see how they explored the coastline, sort of desperately looking for these river passages that they thought would take them through the continent. The most important one to note is up at the top of the map where you can see Cartier and Champlain. They went down the entire St. Lawrence River all the way to the waterfalls at Montreal and then beyond to the Great Lakes. So when they first arrive in the Great Lakes, they think that they've arrived at the Pacific Ocean when in fact that was not the case. So you can see they also explored the Mississippi River. So the reason you're going to have French trading posts not only in what is today Canada, but then also in what was then the Mississippi River Valley, is because of the fact that they were exploring these rivers, desperately trying to find a way through, to try to get through North America to get to the other side. In the meantime, though, they're going to set up these trading posts, predominantly Quebec and Montreal, and they're going to work with the Native Americans because they don't see them as anything other than a resource to trade with. And that's going to be really important for the French because they're going to be more of an adaptive approach instead of a conquering approach. And we're going to talk about that later on. Finally, if you think about the English approach, the English are going to come last to this party. They're going to be the last ones to really come along this exploration route, but they're also going to end up being the most important. And let me explain why that is. If we compare the different reasons for colonization, we can look at each of the 4 European countries, and we're going to not worry so much about Portugal because they're not going to have that big of an effect on America, but we're going to look at the 3 countries that will have a big effect on America. We're going to look at Spain, France, and England. So let's take a look at each of these and sort of consider who these people were, why they came, and what happened as a result. So as we know, Spain was the first. After Columbus opens the door, you're going to have all these conquistadors and Catholic missionaries coming to spread the word of God and search for gold. So what happens as a result? Well, first of all, they're going to be successful early on. They are going to find gold. They are going to be able to force these people to convert to Catholicism. And in fact, they're going to build a whole system which becomes known as the encomienda system, which was an economic system of plantations where they would have these Native Americans working on the land for them, and they would provide food, and they would convert them, and all these missions that they would start. We think about these places like San Diego, San Francisco, these sand mission places that were established throughout the Central and South American region, and then later into the west coast of the United States. They would set up these missions where they would try to convert the natives. And eventually you're going to have a mixed breed. You're going to have some Spanish interbreeding with natives. Those people become known as mestizos. So you have almost like a mixed breed of Spanish and native peoples that come as a result of this invasion of the conquistadors. But something happens in 1588 that will change everything. The Spanish Armada is destroyed off the coast of England by a freak storm that happens in 1588. So if you think about it, from 1492 to 1588, the Spanish are going to dominate colonization of the Americas. They're going to be the ones that really control all of the New World. But once that Armada is destroyed in 1588, it leaves a huge void for these other European countries to now take a step forward and try to do something. So as I said before, France is going to look for this Northwest Passage. So they're going to send explorers and Jesuit priests over. But remember, they're not here to settle. They're not here to really, cause long-term settlements. They're really just looking for a way through. So the St. Lawrence and Mississippi River valleys are going to be the key to those explorations. And they're just going to set up trading posts for trade with these natives. They're going to trade especially furs from beaver pelts. They're going to trade with these natives. And eventually they'll trade other things like tobacco and fish. But for the most part, you're looking at them trading fur, which was very valuable in Europe. So the French are finding ways to adapt. They're trying to find ways to work with the natives so they can get more wealth from them, rather than try to convert them and kill them and destroy them and force them to change. And really, there is no gold in the northern part of North America, so they weren't looking for that. They were just looking for a way through, which they will ultimately never find. So into this void that the Spanish have left, we have some French explorers, but we're really going to have an enormous number of English settlers. And the reason is that these early English settlers, although initially they're looking for wealth, they will eventually be followed by all kinds of other people from England. Because of all the European countries, England has the most people who are seeking religious freedom. There are people who are looking for political freedom and people who are looking for economic freedom. And as a result, you have all these people from England who are looking for a new start, who are looking for a new life. And so not so much in France, not so much in Spain, but in England there's an enormous number of people who want to come. So despite their early colonial failures, like Newfoundland and Popham and Roanoke colonies, those colonies all failed, the English settlers are going to start to learn how to adapt. And that adaptation is going to lead to the development of the 13 colonies.